So we have a very different account of the origin of Israel in the book of Judges.
When you get to the end of Joshua, you think they're done. You've got a full list, you've got a full statement, and Joshua finished, conquered the whole thing, and here's where they all settled. And then suddenly Judges pops up, and it's as if at least some of that didn't actually happen.
Well, yeah, I love this passage at the end of Judges chapter 1. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. And by the time you get through with this, you're left kind of wondering, what did they do? And I think actually if you map this out, what it comes down to is they occupied the highlands.
Right.
And they didn't dislodge any of the cities.
Right. Now, given that Joshua makes clear that they dislodged all those cities and conquered those cities, how do you understand this? Do you think that this is, do you think Joshua is a later sort of tradition of the conquest, one that doesn't have to worry about quite so many historical realities, maybe?
Well, that's how it would seem to me. How would one come to write an account of the conquest of a walled city by saying what you got to do is march around it 7 times? You can only do that if you are not impeded by any evidence or knowledge of facts. Mm-hmm. And now, Judges, on the other hand, probably has a lot more local color.
I mean, entirely. And even though Judges, like Joshua, talks about all of Israel collectively, when we get into the actual individual stories that make up what we think of as the stories of the Judges, all Israel often seems to be something of a stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little area here or a little area there, and it tells us often where they ruled or where they operated, and it's almost never national, completely a national movement of any sort.
That's right. So that when you read through the book of Judges, you may think you're reading about things that were happening to all Israel all of the time. But if you read it a little bit more closely, you see, here's something that happened in one tribe, here's something that happened in another tribe, and you string them all together.
Now, what's so striking is that essentially it's the same thing that's happening to every tribe, whether seriatim, as in the text, or in some other way. What seems to be constantly happening in the book of Judges is outsiders, non-Israelites, mostly foreigners. I mean, it's the Canaanites in a place or two, but it's the Philistines, it's the Ammonites, it's whoever that is sort of attacking, conquering, or otherwise harassing Israel.
Yes.
For some. The way that the book is laid out, it's as if that happens over and over and over again to all of Israel. But as we were just saying, it's more like if you imagined Israel as a bunch of relatively small tribal groupings and settlements, they were all kind of constantly being harassed by their neighbors. And that doesn't strike me as historically crazy in any sense.
No, it's not. What is remarkable, though, is you never see them harassing anybody.
Do you think that's historically accurate?
There may be an exception or two to that now that I think about it. We'll end up with practically civil war at the end. Fighting between tribes.
At the end, but that's almost outside of the core of the book.
My guess is that this is like happened in America even before the colonial period. Tribes fight each other. And the fighting is likely to go both ways. Mm-hmm. But it's construed in Judges as punishment that besets Israel, and then each tribe stands for Israel in microcosm.
Right. I mean, so there is here there's a theologizing of what is essentially looks like a fairly standard political situation, which is something that we have throughout the entire Deuteronomistic history.
Now, a nice formulation here of the theologizing of it in chapter 2, verses 11 and following. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals, and abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors. notice, of course, if you worship Baal, you're abandoning Yahweh. Most of them probably wouldn't have seen it that way. Just shake a little incense in all directions. Then they abandoned the Lord, worshipped Baal and the Astartes, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them and sold them into the power of their enemies.
Now, that what you just said could lead into literally any of the stories of the judges.
Yeah.
Right? It had there was nothing specific about what Israel was doing except worshiping poorly. There was nothing specific about who the enemies are that are now plundering Israel, or in which generation or in which place. It's almost a perfect redactional thematization.
Yeah.
But here's how we're going to understand everything that happens from now on. When Israel is suffering, this is why.
And then what will happen? The Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them.
Again, which judges? Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. You might think that these judges are all going to tell them, now you be good Israelites and keep the law. But then think who some of these judges will turn out to be. Samson, for example. Samson wasn't in the business of telling people to keep the law. He was a big, strong man. And that's what you wanted. And this is the pattern.
So let's talk for a second then, because I think it's really interesting, about essentially the disconnect between the way that the historian gives us this theological framing for the content. Israel did poorly and disobeyed and raised a judge to rescue them. And then, in between these sort of statements, you get episodes, some long, some very short, just a sentence or two.
Yeah.
But some a chapter long, some half a chapter, some, as in Samson, multiple chapters long. None of which, during the actual stories, say anything about that kind of theological framing.
Right. Yeah.
That has always suggested, I think, to most scholars that the stories of the judges existed not just independently, but probably as a collection prior to them being included in the Deuteronomistic history. And again, this gets back to something we were saying earlier in the first session here, which is that the historian doesn't care whether the stories he's borrowing from agree with his theology. He is just going to make them work. And so here are stories about local heroes who go out and sometimes it's just the story of Ehud and Eglon. Right? The story is nothing other than Ehud sneaks in and stabs a guy while he's going to the bathroom. That's the story. Our historian looks at that and goes, and that's why you have to obey, kids. Right? There's no problem forcing stuff in.
It's really folklore. The substratum, is folklore. Memorable stories. And Judges is just full of them.
Sure. They're not so different from Washington crosses the Delaware kind of stories, or or similar kinds of in the Bible even, right? The stories of David's warriors in Samuel, right? Yeah. Where we get and this one fought off 3 bears with his bare hands, and that one fought a lion and also a Philistine. These stories that grow up around these legends, these sort of founding figures in these various areas, perhaps.
Yeah, one of the remarkable ones that comes up early in the book is the story of Deborah and then of Jael. Mm-hmm. Now, Deborah is remarkable because she is a woman, and you don't get that many women in positions of leadership, sort of.
Or the Bible generally.
Yeah. But here you do.
Yeah, so, in a story that has 2 female protagonists, and in which the men are, especially in the poetic version that comes in chapter 5, the men seem to be portrayed as particularly weak. Yes. And this was the Deborah story is an interesting one, in part because it is one of the few where the enemy is the Canaanites. Yeah. And it's one of the few that actually does seem to call on a notion of Israel as a collective whole, or at least multiple tribes acting in solidarity.
Yeah.
Now, as you well know, the funny thing about the tribes acting in solidarity in the Deborah story is they're not all the same tribes that we know from Genesis, say.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, it just shows you that there were fluctuating alliances of tribes. And it raises the question, was Israel a unity to begin with? And that there surely were strains. We have this nice picture that we get eventually in the Bible that Israel is the union of the tribes that worship Yahweh. Mm-hmm. But was it always so? Evidently, there are some, who didn't make it all the time. There were tensions between Judah and the others that will come out eventually. You have one called Meroz that gets cursed here, and we're not at all sure who that was.
Yeah,
a tribe must have worked.
Areas like Gilead that were not part of the full tribal system as it eventually became are included here. Some scholars have made really interesting connections between Judges and Genesis.
Yeah.
In a way that I think is relatively productive, precisely because it's like they're both doing the same thing but coming at it from different directions. Genesis has us begin with Abraham and then his family, and the 12 tribes are Jacob's 12 children, and that group becomes Israel. And Judges has us start with tribes also, individual tribes, and also describes them as all Israel. But it's like they're two panels as opposed to a continuous whole.
Yeah, and Judges really doesn't make any attempt to trace them to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Sure.
How much does it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's to my mind, and again, the question of, is there some historical truth? What we talk about with Ai and Jericho, and you brought up in the earlier session with Judges. Are these stories true? I mean, it says patently not, but there is something more true about the way that Judges describes Israel as a loose confederation of tribes, if confederation at all.
Yeah. A
loose grouping of tribes that gets together for military purposes on occasion. You can see it already gesturing toward what's going to happen in Samuel with the Saul and David bringing the tribes together and creating Israel that way. So I think there's good historical memory in Judges, at least of the social circumstances.
And most of these stories probably had some kind of nucleus to start with. But again, you wouldn't really want to try to write precise history on the basis of it.
Sure. But I mean, one of the things you do see here, though, is how important tribes were. When Israel all comes from Abraham or Jacob, tribes become almost simply merely a genealogical division.
Yeah.
Here, tribes are far more a central part of identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's something that plays out over the course of the book.